Everyone, and welcome to this important afternoon session. My name is Robert Greenhill. I'm Chief Business Officer of the World Economic Forum. And over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been tremendous criticism of some of the excesses and failings of business or certain businesses. The Edelman Trust Barometer had some good news in the last week or so that showed that trust in business has edged up. The bad news is it's edged up from 47 to 56% trusting. And that's the highest level it's been at in about 5 years. And, part of the reaction has been new regulations. Some would say waves of regulations. Some would say regulations that were long due. But there's a question whether or not you can regulate yourself to good conduct. There's also a challenge in a world where people are increasingly aware of diversity and where there's also a bit of a challenge of moral relativism as to whether or not there is a consistent underpinning or foundation for appropriate behavior by corporations. And as part of the discussions over the last year, increasingly it's focused on, is there a moral foundation for our economy, or is it simply a set of economic interactions? 200 years ago, slavery was seen as an appropriate instrument of economic activity. Clearly that's seen today as immoral. Are there other elements of behavior that are seen as immoral? Or are there new elements of behavior that are seen as essential in terms of having a moral and therefore sustainable economy? We have a tremendous panel here today to talk about and to debate some of these issues. We also have comments from Twitter and Facebook, which we'll be calling upon, and we look forward very much to an active interaction with the audience. I would like to start this by, Mary Robinson, turning to you, because you, as President of Ireland, as the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, and now as one of the elders, has been very involved in looking at these issues from a variety of different points of view. And let me ask you, what's your sense of the degree to which, with all the diversity of views and backgrounds and perspectives, is there any common bedrock foundation for a moral economy?
I believe there is, and I'm really pleased to take part of this panel, because basically we have to have shared values. We're in a crowded world already with 7 billion people, a very unequal world, and it's going to go up to 9 billion by 2050. And the elders have been thinking a lot about this, so I'm really pleased to be here. We think a lot about human dignity, and the interesting thing is that human dignity is a core part of human rights. In fact, the first sentence of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a wonderful visionary statement which every government has accepted. Implementing is another matter. But the beginning of it is, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And when I talk to students, I say to them, and dignity comes before rights, note. And somehow human rights became a little bit narrower, a little bit more aggressive, and also conflictual. When you say the words human rights, it means different things. I think if we link human rights and human dignity, we're much closer to the real values of human rights. And speaking to Jim Wallis's idea of a covenant, which he'll be talking about, a possible social covenant, there's also in the Universal Declaration a very interesting responsibility. Article 29 talks about everyone has duties to the community, without which you don't reach the full expression of your personality. How's that for an idea? And it's like the Ubuntu in Africa, or we have a concept of mehel in Ireland. Now, traditionally, international human rights was about governments signing covenants and conventions and then being held to account to implement them, and civil society played a role. But an enormously important thing happened quite recently. A 6-year work of a special representative of the UN Secretary General, John Ruggie. He consulted very widely with business, with NGOs. I remember some really interesting and sometimes quite conflictual arguments. Was he going far enough, etc.? And he came up with a framework which clarifies what is the responsibility of governments, what's the responsibility of business, and that we need better remedies. It's called the Protect, Respect and Remedies. The protect is the higher standard of governments, that they must protect people from violations by business of their human rights. And then you have, for the first time, and it has been accepted by the Human Rights Council, that all corporations have a responsibility to respect human rights. And essentially, it's not a sort of passive do no harm. I don't know that I'm doing any harm. It's a due diligence. I have to kind of know what's happening in the supply chain, what's happening in the business of my company. And for the companies that have embraced these UN guiding principles that spelled out this framework, I think it's very positive because they have reduced their risk and they've increased their sustainability. As a part of sustainability, it's been incorporated into the OECD guidelines for multinationals, into the IFC recent standards, into the ISO 26000. And more, this is going to become, I think, a standard. And so I offer it, in a way, in this discussion, as part of the building blocks, the UN guiding principles. And Robert, you very kindly ensured, because when we talked about this, that there would be copies of the basic documents for people, so they don't go away saying, what was she talking about? How do I find this out? Actually, you can find the documents in the room and on the website so that people can understand that this is actually a great piece of work that's very relevant to the 21st century, to the increasing importance of the role of the private sector and a moral standard of behavior for the private sector based on dignity and rights.
And remember, we're going to come back to this. How does one actually do these kind of things in addition to all the other activities, regulations, and so on? How does that make that happen? And I want to come back to that, but before we do that, Bill, I want to come to you as a former CEO, as a Baker Scholar, Harvard MBA grad, former CEO of Medtronics, but also on the board of directors of both Goldman Sachs and ExxonMobil. You're seeing overall and by sectors some of these challenges. Where do you fit in this question of the moral underpinnings of the corporation versus the legal or economic structures of the corporation?
Well, the good news is that since the financial collapse of 2008, corporations are going through a fundamental rethinking of their role in society. And of course, my message to that is it's about time. Where have we been? Because corporations are chartered by society. One of the great misnomers, and as much as I respect the late Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, he was fundamentally wrong in what he had to say about the role of the corporations. We're not just in business to serve our shareholders. But all too often, the stakeholder discussion becomes posited shareholders versus stakeholders, which is fundamentally wrong. We're in business to serve society, which is often the, if you will, the overlooked stakeholder. My colleague Michael Porter, who is an economist, wrote quite a courageous article in the Harvard Business Review 2 years ago this month, talking about creating shared value. That is our role. We're there to create value for society. And I think one of the important things is that through our missions, at Medtronic, we had a mission to restore people to full life and health. And people often cited the fact that we went from 1 billion to 60 billion in terms of our market capitalization. But the thing I personally look back in that era as being most proud of, we used to restore 300,000 new patients every year to full life and health. Now that number is 10 million. But that's a vital responsibility, because if one product fails, someone's going to die. And so you have this huge responsibility. But I do think that there is a growing awareness. John Mackey, just the founder of Whole Foods, who has a marvelous view of the role of providing food as medicine, as healthcare, basic, and how you help people, wrote a new book. Full disclosure, I wrote the foreword, but I think it's a wonderful, talking about conscious capitalism and how we need to get away from crony capitalists or spending their time in Washington influencing politicians, and really be very conscious about all of our actions and what our roles are and how we're there to serve society. And I think many more CEOs, I'd mentioned Paul Pullman at Unilever, someone who's putting sustainability at the top of his agenda, and as he said to me on Monday, he said, we're not doing sustainability to make money. You know, we make money so that we have the right to create sustainable products and work with people to help people on the planet. And that opens up our opportunities not just to serve, if you will, the traditionally developed nations, but really people throughout the world. So I think we're seeing a big change as companies become more global, and we'll hear from Feike and we'll hear from Carlos. We have corporations now that see this a vital role to really open up the whole world. So I'm very encouraged by what's coming.
Bill, let me come. You mentioned what you've been doing in Medtronics, and it was interesting the point that Mary made about human dignity. Yeah. And I think one of the points, Jim, in the note, and these have all been circulated. You have them with you. One of the things you say, Jim, is the dignity of the human person, whatever their race, gender, background, or belief, as part of a core element of a moral foundation. And in preparation for this, I was going through, what have leaders done in the past? And there's a quote from And I'll read the quote. "It is the policy of this organization to hire people who have the personality, talent, and background to fill a given job, regardless of race, color, or creed." You know, that's a pretty modern statement. Actually, it was written in a policy led by Thomas J. Watson, Jr. of IBM in 1953, over a decade before the Civil Rights Act, where a CEO took a very public and courageous step in terms of what he saw as the moral foundations of his organization. So, Bill, what's happened?
Where have we been? We got distorted, and we started bowing to Wall Street, and we started to think we would bow to these pressures. And I hear so many corporate leaders saying, well, I have to meet Wall Street's needs. No, actually, your job is to do your job well, and in turn, your shareholders will be well served. And sometimes you need just tell, this is what we stand for, and we hope you'll go along with those goals, but if not, move on. And I think Watson got that, but often corporations moved away from that. Certainly IBM did in the late 80s, and my friend and colleague Sam Palmisano restored that sense of serving society. And I think, and it does involve the dignity of everyone who works with, everyone you're associated, every customer, every person you associate with. I think it deserves and has a right to that level of respect.
And Feike, I want to turn to you, because Felix Ashima, the Chief Executive Officer of Royal DSM out of the Netherlands, you've talked very publicly about the need to look for people, planet, and profit. Three crispy words, more challenging to make it happen. I mean, first of all, why do you see it that way? And then as a sitting CEO who has to deal on a daily basis with the challenges of both shareholders and stakeholders, how's this working? What works? What are the challenges in doing this?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And I build further on what Bill said. And let me take you with me very rapidly through my logic. I'll do it extremely fast, but this is a great audience, can do it. And I built up why we need to do the things, and then what we do. We all know about the problems of the world: climate change, shortage of energy, shortage of resources, food problems, etc. Good. Second step. Nobody is able to solve that alone. Not any government, not any company. Nobody has the abilities to solve that. Even stronger, business needs to be involved in order to solve all those problems. Because business is having the access to the technologies, the innovations, etc. The impact of business increased tremendously in the last 50 to 100 years. There are companies who have more money in the drawer than countries have, or companies are able to destroy parts of this planet. Companies are able to solve big problems. So the impact is tremendously. If your impact is high, your responsibility is high. Only conclusion you can draw, you need to work for stakeholders and not only for your shareholders, which is only one of your stakeholders. So you need to create value on multiple dimensions. Of course, economic value and profit. Nobody is bringing us at the end of the week a bucket with money. So we need to take care that we make some money. However, we need to provide societal value for the people on this planet. We need to make value, we need to create value for the planet itself. As not derived goals, but as primary goals of the company. So there's a primary goal of this company to make the planet a better place. The people and the planet as well. Yeah. Is that what is your primary goal, or is that a derived goal of making profit? No, that's a primary goal of the company. Do we do that enough as companies? No. We derailed even the last 30, 40 years, and we made one big mistake. We thought the economy and economic growth and economic profits is a goal. Wrong. It's a means. It's where the economy started, creating value for people and planet. The economy never started with making profit. The economy started with creating well-being for people on this planet, with people and planet. There it started. And the last 30, 40 years, we completely derailed, and we need to reconnect as business with society, because people in society are dealing with those problems I mentioned, with food and climate change, etc. Those are their problems. So we as business, if we can contribute to that, we need to reconnect with society and make that as our primary goals, and see the economy at best as a sub-goal, better as a means to the higher goal, to take care of the well-being for people on this planet. And business, increasingly in the last 50 or 100 years, have the key in their hands to contribute to that.
Feike, I mean, one of the challenges of making this happen is, well, what are the incentives of the executives? Particularly if people, aren't necessarily with the company for their entire career, but are there for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. I mean, how do you actually align incentives with that kind of an approach? Can you? And then secondly, that sounds great, but actually, what does that mean in terms of shareholders and shareholder reaction and to that kind of a statement? And what's worked, again, what hasn't?
Well, maybe two short things. One is, if you believe, and I'm sure the audience will do, with the storyline I just had, and he say companies need to create value on 3 dimensions, then it is strange that the value of a company is mainly represented by its economic value and not on the value creation of the other 2 dimensions. So we need to develop a new economic system. I think it's inevitable that we redesign our economic model and anchor value creation on the other 2 dimensions in the value of the company. And you can do that by changing tax systems, and that is one of my proposals. If you follow that philosophy as a company, you need to do that extremely consistent, point what you were referring to. Of my short-term incentive, or my long-term incentive, 50% is fully dependent on achieving sustainability goals and not financial goals. And there are more of those kind of things. If you go this direction as a company and do not take care that at least 4 out of your 5 decisions are fitting in this model, nobody will believe you. It needs to be much more than just more than half. So 4 out of 5 decisions need to fit. I'm not holy, so you can be pragmatic from time to time, but take care that in everything you do, you follow this logic.
Jim Wallis, you're the President Chief Executive Officer of Sojourners, but you've also been very engaged on a lot of the debate around values. And one of the challenges now is there's a sense that the social contract that existed within society is broken down in the last few years. The sense that people came from different backgrounds, but they had an equality of opportunity. Particularly if they had the right education, they worked hard. Each generation could hope that their children would they would have done better than their parents and their children would do better than them. And that the economic system was such that if people worked hard, got an education, they could find a job. And today, for many youth around the world, particularly in places such as Southern Europe, where youth unemployment's at 40, 50%, there's a sense that's broken down. But you haven't called for a restoration of a social contract, per se. You've actually talked about, in this paper which is being circulated, the need for a new social covenant, which is interesting because it's the same kind of language that came out of the Role of Business Global Agenda Council, looking at the same issue, this concept of a focus on covenant rather than contract. What do you mean by that? What's the difference?
Your opening question to us, is there a moral foundation for an economy? Now, from the faith community, you'd expect me to say yes, and I do. But I also want to say that the economy, the market, cannot work if there is no moral foundation, especially in the long term. So the big news this week outside of Davos is the World Economic Forum has convened this amazing group of world leaders, all right here. That's the news outside. The big news, or what should be the big news or disturbing news on the inside of Davos, is that so many of those people on the outside, a majority of them, don't trust the institutions that are here on the inside and the way we are making decisions. Now, business for sure, government, but I would say it applies even to civil society and even to religion, that distrust that's out there. Why? I think you're right. It's that that broken social contract, opportunity, social mobility, security, an expected future, that's all breaking down. Social contracts are all breaking down. So what we're looking at is how do you not just do a new transactional analysis, but the idea of a social covenant really is more of a moral conversation. It's promises we're making to each other. How do you restore the trust? The World Economic Forum is uniquely situated to find collaborative ways between our sectors to restore the trust that's so massively broken down. So we're suggesting there are 3 values that we think really can come from a consensus across religion and culture. One, you've already mentioned, human dignity, fundamental human dignity. Mary spoke so eloquently to that. The second is the common good. that transcends just our individual interests. Politically, you said this morning, I love that common good, but we mean different things. I said, that's right. The debate about the common good as the metric is the only way to resolve political problems. And third, a word that comes from our tradition, stewardship. Stewardship of the planet and of posterity. Native people say the way you make a decision today, the metric for it is the impact on the 7th generation out. That's a different metric than quarterly profit and loss statements, right? So what we're saying is we need a conversation. This is not a document to go home and put on your shelf, but a broad conversation globally about what it would mean to create a new social covenant. Now, being the chair of the Values Council, which is a funny thing to say, which council, Values Council, as if the other councils aren't about values. They're all about values. We've lost our sense of values. But I think we've had terrific values discussions here at Davos. The world's looking for values decisions beyond just values discussions. They have to see how our values conversation is helping us make better decisions. And that's what I think the social covenant tries to do. And I'll just read from this first quick paragraph. The choices made about each issue, unemployment, youth unemployment, inequality, maldistribution, all of that, must be determined by the values we hold, applied by government, business, civil society. These choices need to be self-conscious, not based on the inertia of accumulated interests. This is more than a philosophical enterprise. It is an urgent matter that requires moral courage, and the stakes are high.
It's interesting because one of the elements people talked a lot about here over the last few days is mindfulness. And it's interesting because essentially you say not just individual mindfulness, but actually social mindfulness as well. And how does actually one make that real? And Carlos Danel, I think in a sense, you've started with values and then incorporated it into your business system. You're the CEO of Compartamos in Mexico, which is a microfinance organization really focused on helping those most in need. That actually made the decision to structure it as a for-profit enterprise that's actually listed. You're very involved as a young global leader, but also on the Global Agenda Council on Women's Empowerment. So looking at this very much from a values perspective, but how are you taking some of those things that have just been discussed and put forward by Jim? I mean, how have you put that in there, but also how do you handle that challenge between trying to do good while also trying to make a return for those people who actually bought your shares?
Yes. Well, I think we come from a point where, first of all, we do see this shift in the business attitudes, in which our belief has always been that historically, any business that has prevailed through time and has done well is a business that, in its core, is solving somebody's social and most intimate problems. We come from a generation, I hope, of businesses that live at this intersection where we see social problems and then figure out that there are commercial or business tools that we can use to solve those social problems. So in many ways, we're companies, I think, in this generation that have very explicit and very strong and very alive sense of purpose. In our case, we're trying to, through the provision of financial services, through financial inclusion, to provide equality of opportunity for people that have been underserved and unserved traditionally. And we try to do this very explicitly, trying to manage and trying to create three types of value: social value, economic value, as well as what we call human value. And we have a very simple but very clear definition of what we mean by this. We mean by social value that we want to provide access to financial services to as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time and in a way that they can benefit from these financial products. We then want to create financial value because we believe that profits are a means to an end. It allows us to grow and to provide more opportunities for people. And then human value, which is less often talked about, but that in our case means that we want to create an environment where clients, our staff, our providers, and all stakeholders have a chance to become better people. And what's interesting about this is that we then go out and set goals and metrics on those three types of values. And we hold ourselves accountable to those three sets of value. So yes, we are a company that needs to be profitable in order to attract capital from the capital markets. But at the end of the day, we have not done our sense of purpose if that is the only thing that we are focusing on.
And Carlos, how do you do that? That third set that you were talking about, where you're saying you can put metrics against those kind of values. What are examples of what you measure and challenge yourself against?
Well, for example, we want to know, in terms of, for example, a social value, we want to know what markets are we serving, how, in the terms of what are the characteristics of the markets that we're serving in Mexico and Central America and South America, and really know that we're dealing with the underserved and that the kind of products that we're tending to them are benefiting their life. For example, we have a consumer protection index that is within, which is funny because consumer protection usually comes from the outside as regulation. But we've actually beforehand created an internal consumer protection index in which we hold ourselves accountable to 7 principles: transparency in pricing, fair collection practices, and so on. And we want to know that we have actually an ombudsman within the company that is looking out for that protection. So in many ways, I think that the actual role of governance, because there are tensions. I mean, when you have all these different sets of objectives and metrics, what one needs to first be aware of is that there is tension between them sometimes. It's very hard if you think about maximizing every different goal that you have. But there is a space where they live and they actually reinforce each other. And the role of governance, and I would say even the role of management, is how do you align the incentives of all shareholders in a way that it makes sense to then have a shared set of not only values, but of a sense of purpose. And that's the real challenge. I'll end with this. It's easy enough when you're starting up a young company like ours. When we're 100 people, it's easy enough to have to shared values and shared sense of purpose. We now have 17,000 people on staff. And I can easily tell you that through our history, the thing I've spent most time dealing with, and this thing I've spent most time building in the company as a CEO, is that, shared values and shared sense of purpose.
And a lot of activist shareholders, others might say to Feike, you're focusing on the wrong things. It should just be about shareholder value. Carlos, you've got criticism from the other side that people saying, by actually engaging in a capitalist structure for this, you've sold out on your value should be, not a for-profit model. It should be focused. So we've heard how Feike would respond to that criticism. How do you respond to that criticism that comes from exactly the other side?
Exactly, yes. So one of the things that's interesting about Compartamos, it was the first microfinance company that was publicly listed in a stock exchange, the Mexican Stock Exchange. And we got this whole concern, which I think was very sensible concern from the industry, which was born more out of the social sector than the business sector, that by bringing in traditional investors, we would then forget about the interests of the clients and other stakeholders and only focus on the needs and the incentives of the shareholders. What we found after being public for 7 years is that, in essence, that's a very simplistic way of looking at things. One, because we also, like to label the markets and investors are, the only thing they care is about profits. And yes, they do have a mandate and they do have fiduciary duties, and they are looking out for a return. But we also find that when you engage in certain conversations with investors and with the markets, they also understand the creation of other value, because they also understand that long-term survival and sustainability of companies also relies on that. So we try, and it's not a science, it's more of an art than a science to really, how do you then balance the different incentives? And let me give you a very concrete example. Compartamos has been a very profitable company. It went to the market being very profitable. And for 20 years, we've been able to increase our returns every single year. Last year, we said, guess what? We're not going to increase our returns because we're doing this, that, and the other, which essentially means providing wider services in savings to people that are very far in rural areas in Mexico. And at the end of the day, I think that a values-driven company is less about talking and more about your behavior. And yes, we got the effect that we expected in the market. Some investors did not understand that. what they do is they sell their shares, and that has an effect on the share. But again, I think the governance of the institution, its role is to stand by its decisions and really look out for the benefit, in this case, of all stakeholders.
Bill, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, let me make a strong statement that any company that only focuses on its shareholders, creating shareholder value, will eventually self-destruct. And I can give you many, many examples. We've been studying these companies in our work at Harvard. General Motors, a classic case. Took 50 years because of the value of their brand name, but they did self-destruct. I would also mention Kodak, the inventor of digital photography that's now bankrupt, Sears Roebuck, Kmart. These are all organizations that lost their way. I think what the global companies we're saying today really recognize that the only way to run the company is to create a sense of shared purpose and values. As referring again to Sam Palmisano, as he said, you cannot run a company just with rules and regulations. People don't get that. They don't understand that. And until you bring people together around this shared sense of purpose and values, you can't get there. And then I think Carlos is properly saying, then you have to align the incentives to reflect this needs of whom you're serving. And until you do that, if you don't look at all those needs of whom you're serving, then you will lose your way, because if you pay people for short-term results, financial results, then that's what they're going to focus on. So you need to have this sense, again, of aligned incentives. And I think the thing that corporations are finally recognizing is that, they've been serving the top of the pyramid. I don't want to speak in pejorative terms, but the top of the economic pyramid. They've been not serving 80% of the people. The new CEO of Medtronic, who was born in Bangladesh, is now opening the company up to truly serve the entire pyramid. That's what Carlos is showing, that can be done. And I believe at one time you were the most profitable bank in Mexico.
Yes.
Serving, I hate to say the bottom of the pyramid, but certainly the people with the least economic means. Is that true?
True. Right.
Mary?
I think these values are really good to hear from the different business perspectives. But to me, the fact that we have a normative framework it sort of reinforces and provides a context for that, so that not all corporate leaders have felt values that are represented on this panel, and it is really important to have a way of measuring and to have accountability and to have it as a normative framework. I worked within the UN system, and I know that when you mention the United Nations, people say, and I use Churchill's description of democracy, that it was the worst system except for all the others. The UN has a little bit of being the worst system, but it also has a great value of having the moral right to set out these principles in the area of the environment or human rights or whatever. And the guiding principles for business and human rights are very business-friendly, if I could put it that way. We were talking at a private meeting that Microsoft hosted this afternoon, and Brad Smith was saying, when we went to implement, it's written in the right way. We took it step by step. We did our due diligence. We did our human rights assessment, and it was clear that this is not difficult rules and regulations. But I also agree that those rules will not have the same value unless there's also the sort of sense that, as you've been saying, what the license of corporations in our world is. Mm-hmm. It's not just to make profits. It is, in fact, as you have put so well, all four of you, to serve and to be part of resolving common problems and to provide, in particular, because we're in a unique position now because of climate change, that we're facing a situation where we probably have about 7 or 8 years in which to stop a climate change cliff, which will put any fiscal cliff in the shadow. Mm-hmm. And so the need to come together on values is huge.
I'm going to just turn to this. If there's anybody in the audience who wants to make a short intervention or ask a question, please put up your hand and I'll recognize you in just a moment. I want to read a couple of the things coming off over Facebook and Twitter first, then turn to you, Jim, for your comments on it. One is from Sarah S. It says, capitalism is inherently moral. Don't blame the system for human failings. Yet an Ad Global underline Beth says there needs to be checks and balances. Greed is too tempting. Jim, what's your sense?
Well, Adam Smith agreed with much of what we're saying here today. What do you do when the invisible hand lets go of the common good? That happens. Let's go with the common good. I learned in the South African struggle that hope is not a feeling or optimism. Desmond Tutu taught me this. Hope is a decision you make. And so I want to be hopeful about this. I'm hopeful hearing all of this. But you've got to be hopeful and then identify obstacles. What are the obstacles? And I'll just name a couple. Bill's aware of this. I was on a panel the first few years ago about this topic, and a CEO was so inspirational about this, and she really tried to apply her values to her huge company. But then she had a huge stockholder rebellion against her, and some of the stockholders were, they have been members of her shareholders for 6 weeks, didn't care much about the legacy brand of her company down the road, but that was an obstacle. Then Mohammed Yunus and I run a similar panel the next year about values, and he had the entire crowd eating out of his hand because social business was his, he wasn't on a philanthropy, but how to use business to solve problems, microfinance, and people were with him all the way until he said, but then we have to invest the profits from this business into solving the next problem and the next business, and we don't have the executive compensation that we're kind of used to. And it was like, okay, time for lunch. So what are the obstacles? I really think we're not going to win this by doom and gloom on panels like this and saying, oh, it'll never happen. How do you put forward a vision of real content and hope that new values lead to new practice? Carlos is doing new practices. He doesn't just have new values. He's doing new and different practices. And guess what? They work. They work. But that means you got to identify the obstacles to new practices.
I mean, it's very interesting, taking the human rights elements, having them enshrined in meaningful, focused principles or regulations that can be incorporated into an organization that then actually, in your case, of course, actually get brought down to specific metrics and incentive systems. You actually have the cycle to really affect the practices. What I'd like to do is quickly go to Vijay and then a couple of other people. What I'd like to ask you to do in each case is keep your question or your comment to no more than a minute, please.
Thank you. Vijay Punusami, Etihad Airways, Abu Dhabi. I always believe that for companies to do good, they have to do well. But for them to be able to do well, they have to do good. But this won't happen until we change the way we rate, celebrate, and reward CEOs and companies. I mean, we can't, on the one hand, celebrate a CEO for slashing jobs when society needs more jobs. So we need to really work on the way how we actually rate companies and celebrate them. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, ma'am, and sir beside. Please wait for the microphone.
Linda Woodhead from the UK. There are two very different ethical approaches. One is principles-based, and one is more virtue and character and behaviour-based. And very effective moral shapers, good schools, religions and so on, tend to work with stories and characters and behaviours rather than sets of principles. And there have been a bit of both in your discussions, and I'd like to see which you think is the way forward most effective.
Great point, sir, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Stuart Wallis from the New Economics Foundation and the Values Council, and also a co-author with Jim of the Social Covenant document. I think what we've heard is incredibly hopeful, and especially your story, Carlos, of being a quoted company, not huge, middle-sized, being able to, through leadership, change things. I'm also with Feike totally that we need to get to the point where good behavior, good performance on environmental and social reflects in the value of the company. The question to the panel is, yes, we need, and we're going to try all the things we can over the next year to get a dialogue going, to inspire more leaders to take up the issue of values and make them explicit. But what else does that need to be accompanied by? Mary's comment about a normative framework. What are the practical actions short-term that the panel recommends we ought to, civil society, unions, business leaders who are progressive, be fighting for? Is it something like you can't vote a stock until you've held it for 2 years? What is it that we should be doing right now in terms of changing the rules of the game as well?
Great. Bill, did you want to follow me?
Yeah, I would love that. In fact, I proposed and hadn't gotten anywhere the idea that the so-called capital gains tax should be based in the United States should be based on how long you've held the stock. I'm on the board of the world's largest company, and I can tell you that 72% of all compensation, once you hit office, is withheld until your retirement or 10 years, whichever is the greater. And the idea is that you're making investment decisions for 25 years. And if you're not concerned about the kind of issues that are going to happen over the next 25 years, then you're going to be not rewarded. But I think society needs to realign incentives too. When we talk about doing it, it's not just executive compensation. For instance, why don't we put a price on carbon? Why don't we put a price on things that you don't do well? Like Medtronic pays a huge price if we have quality problems, okay? There should be a price for that because we have an obligation to do that. We shouldn't be able to just walk away and say, not my problem. You know, if you're dumping chemicals in the Hudson River, there should be a price to do for that because you, or the Rhine for that matter, because you've created the harm, and that needs to be brought into the, if you will, economic equation because you have that obligation.
Okay. Yeah, I think I fully agree with the question which is being posed. At this moment, we are highly dependent on the responsibility of individual companies and individual leaders. It's great in the individual cases, but the problems of the world cannot wait till all individual cases turn into that responsible leadership. So, at the end of the day, I believe we should not only root it into a moral standard, because that will take too long, although I like that idea, but it will take too long. So I think here comes the role of governments in this whole discussion. They need to change their system. They cannot solve the problems anymore. Companies need to help them to solve the problem, but they can help changing the system. Building on what Bill said also, I'm proposing if you create more value on the people or planet dimension, then you pay less taxes. If you create less value, then you pay more taxes. Then there comes an incentive because the value of the company is representing that. Whilst we are addressing that, why does more than 50% of the taxation come from taxation on labor, where it does not represent the dignity we give to human people to price labor expensive and to say to people who are unemployed, we don't need you on this world. No, reduce the taxation on labor, increase the taxation where we want to put a brake on, the use of raw materials. So I think that in those kind of things, governance can play a very important role in steering that in the right direction and not only being dependent on a moral development of companies. Though I like that very much, but I think we need to go a step further, and here governments can play a role, that the value creation is really represented in the value of the company.
Well, that's got a reaction not only from the other panelists, but also on Twitter. You happen to know some of the cyber world agrees with you. Tom Coleman says, by giving a price to humanity values, tax increase for non-moral activities, tax cut for companies that actually have a high score in ethical rankings. And the question is, and it's interesting, some of the fines for environmental issues or other elements are ways of trying to do that. Jim, you wanted to come in here and then... Just
to agree with it, we had these bilaterals the last couple of days, very small group discussions about the social covenant. And one of our discussants, a former head of state, he's still a political leader, he may be head of state again. And here, head of state is in a conversation with 10 people, it doesn't happen real often. But he said a social covenant would help him as a political leader in government, because if not, if you don't have any guidance, any moral guidance that people are talking about, all you can do is negotiate accumulated interests. That's all you're doing. Politics is just interests that you're negotiating all the time. And so the social covenant is not just meant for business, but for government too, and for a new relationship between citizens and business and government and other organizations. So it's a conversation. What we're hoping for is a real strategic dialogue that changes our thinking and then changes our practices about what we need to build something like a new covenantal relationship around what's been broken.
So I'm hearing three levels of engagement. There's the moral decision. Here's what I believe. Here's what I want to implement.
Right.
There's the element of a set of principles, whether in the UN, the human rights principles being enshrined into corporate behavior, right, or the guiding principles behind the social covenants. There's a reference text that may not be legally binding, but actually can lead to common aligned behavior. And the third level that Feike, you're talking about, and Bill, you're saying, is in some cases, government has a role to essentially provide a framework within which companies operate that reflect a certain moral foundation and a moral consensus as to what we want to enable and encourage and require corporations to be accomplishing while they're making money.
Right.
And so you asked the question about principles and values. To me, principles incorporate values. And any corporation that doesn't do that isn't operating by the right set of principles. But I think I would love to see a principles-based approach. Unfortunately, in my country, in the United States, we've fallen back to a rules-based approach, so we're down to regulating people right down. Instead of saying, look, Feike, you're responsible. Okay, and we're going to hold you accountable. Here's the principles by which you have to operate. And if you don't, you're held accountable. And there is an economic price you will pay if you refuse to do that. And I don't know if you consider that's reasonable or not, but I consider it, you know.
No, absolutely. That's what I said. We need to make the next step in order to incorporate this into our system.
Rather than telling you
Now,
how to
I have
do
a
it.
principles-based approach as a moderator. I will decide who's going to be next speaking. That's you.
Okay. Well, I'm agreeing with a great deal of what is being said, and I'm trying to add the value of the fact that governments have acted in this area.
Yeah.
The Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed, first of all, the framework that clarified that governments have the responsibility to protect people against violations of their human rights by corporations. And, you know, we've had that in the extractive industry with indigenous peoples, we've had abuse of migrant work, and so on. And the duty of states, that was never clear before. Secondly, the responsibility of all corporations to respect human rights as being a due diligence responsibility helps greatly what you're talking about, because it says, you know, in the particular sector, I have to look into that. That there has to be some kind of a human rights assessment. Everybody in the corporation can get engaged, and for corporations that have integrated the human rights principles, they then have a great sort of advance on corporate sustainability. But you also need to do the things you're talking about. We need a different set of tax incentives, a different approach to the values, the societal values. And I like the three levels of value. I think that's actually speaking to the 21st century in a way that means that we're right to refresh the earlier values approach. But I would just like to see the UN guiding principles, because they have been well negotiated and approved by government, as a sort of building block of the social covenant.
Mary, can I just chime in here, because I don't think people realize just how heterogeneous and diverse the views are on the Human Rights Council. And actually getting a consensus on almost anything is extraordinary.
And also,
so let me just ask on this, you know, would that have been possible 10 years ago? And if not, why is it possible now to have built that consensus?
I think it was very cleverly handled by Professor John Ruggie. He had worked within the UN system. He actually was one of the co-founders, whatever, of the UN Global Compact, which is very much voluntary, but companies got used to the idea
Launched
of the 10
11 years
principles.
ago with Davos.
Indeed. And he roughed up the human rights community. And I remember my small organization at the time, Realizing Rights, had to be a kind of bridge between angry human rights who say he's going about it the wrong way. He's not starting with victims and working up to responsibility. He's actually having a broad consultation, and he's looking with very good analytical powers into this whole area, and he's clarifying the role of government, and he's clarifying what is an appropriate responsibility, not an unfair one, an appropriate responsibility of business. And he had a huge number of consultations globally. He got great help from law firms, the International Chamber of Commerce, the International Organization of Employers, the trade unions.
So business was engaged in the dialogue,
was very, very
as were
engaged.
others.
But your point is well taken, because it wasn't a government-negotiated text. It was a text that came from all of that with a very good analytical mind of John Ruggie, with a very good team supporting him. First of all on the framework, and then on the guiding principles. And that's why it is user-friendly for business.
So Carlos, I'm going to invite you to intervene now, and I'm also going to invite both you and Feike to talk about if you have or will be signing these human rights principles, so we can build at least the momentum of two other organizations.
Of course. Just wanted to add on kind of the question of what can we act upon to make sure that this moves along, and pretty much kind of on a long term. I myself feel pretty optimistic because of one thing, and that is whenever I talk to students, whenever I talk to undergraduate or graduate students, I see that they are increasingly aware of the fact that they are highly motivated by sense of purpose. I think that if you look at the research that has been done about the so-called millennials, I mean, there's information there that people no longer want to work for a company that just does whatever without being explicit of exactly how they add value to society. And I say awareness because I do believe that this is within human nature, and it always has been. But in the past few years, the corporate sector has kind of lost that sense of motivation within sense of purpose. But millennials are picking that up. So I see a future that where not only entrepreneurs, but really the workforce is going to require out of corporations a moral stance and a principle-based leadership. Now, what I do think that we need to act upon is to make sure that our education system and, doing things like Professor George does through his not only teaching but writing to really help the younger generation to act upon this, to really, not only when they set up businesses, but when they go to work for even a legacy company or an incumbent company, to really make sure that the leadership within those companies has a certain moral standards.
Feike? And then
Yeah, maybe you asked, Mary, you said it in your introduction, is there, what changes the situation that certain things are possible at a certain moment which were not possible before? And yourself, you mentioned the example of slavery. And I don't want to go into that because there are many elements, but one element is at least similar. It has something to do with tension at that moment in time between an economic reality for a certain part of the country especially, and a human part of it. And over time, we synchronized at thoughts at a certain moment that this is not doable anymore, this is not possible, this is not ethical, and we changed that. Interesting to see is in what kind of time we live now. For the last 30 years, we had the environment, sustainability, we called it 30 years ago environment, every time on the agenda. In an economic downturn, it went off of the agenda in the 70s, in the 80s, because we had an economic crisis. This is the first one in the last 30 years, and you see it here at the World Economic Forum. Economic crisis, economic reality down, sustainability higher on the agenda. So apparently, and the WEF plays an important role in this, we are synchronizing thoughts, not of all. There are some opposing still and said, well, wait a minute, you're owned by your shareholders, so you need to provide profit. That's it. No, but more and more synchronization of thoughts. And then the point of Mary comes in. Then certain things are possible today, which were not possible 10 or 15 years ago. Progression of society. In that sense, I'm also positive and hopeful.
That's great. Let's go to a couple of comments. Please, if you could stand up and introduce yourself very quickly.
Uday Kemker from the Kemker Foundation. I want to take a cue off what Carlos said a minute ago, because I think it's profoundly interesting and true about the issue of the way we think about incentives in education. I remember how shocked I was as a young person going into the business world when the operative term about what made an entrepreneur successful was the word hunger, which is a morally very poor, almost bankrupt term. He's hungry, he's going to do super well. And how the framework of incentives in academic literature was all about financial rewards and punishments. What we're talking here about is a view of human motivation that is much, much broader and realistic about what it is that actually motivates human beings to succeed. But for that, we need a moral framework whereby business can be correctly framed from the school system all the way up. People understand the meaning of business. And I wonder whether Quaker entrepreneurs in the 19th century were really seeing things the way that modern business people see things. Perhaps we could go back to some of those values. Thank you.
Excellent point. And let me just note here, J. Provera notes, if you add a degree of empathy to the education of C-suite corporate initiatives, you instantly have a more moral capitalism. There's over here, two gentlemen, please, at the back.
Peter Prove from the Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance and a member of the Global Agenda Council on the Role of Faith. I wanted to make a link with a fascinating session I attended yesterday on impact investing, which approached essentially the same issue from a very different direction. And the observation was made by the manager of quite a substantial investment fund that what is most needed now is for some exceptionally clever person to develop metrics that enable financial value to be blended with social value in a single bottom line. And that for that clever person, there is a Nobel Prize waiting. Any takers?
Yeah, that's alignment of incentives. Sir, just beside, for 30 seconds, because we're almost at the end.
Jonathan Reckford with Habitat for Humanity. Actually, a follow-up. I'm a huge fan of the work you're doing in microfinance. How, at the detail level in your field organization, do you protect from the pressure, whether for-profit or nonprofit, to creep upmarket, to lend to less needy families, or to marginally increase interest rates? You know, with that, how do you balance profit against pushing down affordability for your customers?
Yeah, it goes back to the issue of incentives. All to the detail, for example, 14,000 of our 17,000 staff are loan officers. They are the people that actually are within the market and tending to the client. So in many ways, they're like your old-fashioned banker, within your neighborhood that knows you. So one of the things that we've always done, and it's very unconventional, for example, in the financial services industry, is the incentive that those loan officers have is not on the volume of the money they lend, but rather the number of clients they serve. So we do $400 loans on average. But a loan officer has no incentive to go out and look for a $15,000 client because, in fact, their incentive is to serve as many people as possible, regardless of how much they lend to. So that's just one example of many, many other small different incentives that and by the way, not only doesn't the loan officer have those types of incentives, but anyone in the institution up to the board level doesn't have that incentive. So again, I think one needs to really spend a lot of time connecting your sense of purpose and what you're trying to do with how you reward people and how you inspire people to work for. And if you get that right, and you don't get it always right, but when you see that it's going somewhere you don't want to, you then correct.
Mary.
Just to be practical, I'm very encouraged by this discussion, and this panel came from some of the global agenda councils coming together about values. And I think we have a kind of almost a mandate to take this and really go further and say, how can we look in the way that we've been talking about at how to really make progress on this? And the structure is there to do it. And I think the fact that it does involve a number of the global agenda councils, human rights, values, business, which you chair, and others.
Well, in fact, what we're doing, we're out of time for this hour, but this is really not the end of the conversation. It's very much the beginning. You'll see the note that the Global Agenda Council on Values has put forward. It's a start of a conversation, a dialogue on this, and what we'll be doing is through the Global Agenda Councils over the next 12 months, continue with this conversation to see what can we take the highest moral principles in a consistent way and apply them through education, through incentives, through engagement of governments and others, to actually have an economy that works, that yields to prosperity, but also has the moral foundations to increase the trust, which is so sorely lacking today. Well, I'd like to thank the panel members for a very encouraging and energetic start to this conversation.